We continue our discussion on national cultures and we focus on cultural dimensions. As we have seen, culture represents the collective programming of the mind, distinguishing members of one group for another. And this is the definition given by Geert Hofstede, a Dutch social psychologist. Culture represents the way we do things around here. And it has several levels. One is that of artifacts, which is visible. We can see furniture, architecture, slogans, technology, art, stories, institutions. Then we have another layer that is partially observable and is represented by values and ideals like respect, ethics, pride and self-esteem, nationalism, competitiveness, caring, optimism. And then deep down we have the basic assumptions, a layer that is invisible and unconscious and hard to recognize from within. For example, the nature of human activity, the nature, how do we regard human nature, the origin of knowledge, the relationship to environment, the nature of reality, time and space. When talking about culture, national cultures, we can take into, and even organizational cultures, we can take into account cultural dimensions, which are defined concepts of a culture that move along a continuum with two poles. While a culture cannot be at any of the extreme, it will find itself somewhere on this continuum. And cultural dimensions reflect essential aspects of cultural differences. These dimensions were developed by Geert Hofstede, you already heard his name a few times so far, who carried out a research in the 60s and 70s in IBM. He surveyed more than 100,000 employees of IBM that was scattered around the world. And he came up with 4 cultural dimensions: power distance, low versus high, individualism versus collectivism, masculinity versus femininity, uncertainty avoidance, low and high. And then later, in 1991, another researcher named Michael Bond added long-term versus short-term perspective. And the research carried by another researcher in 2010, Michael Minkov, added two other dimensions, pragmatic versus normative, which corresponds roughly to the long-term versus short-term approach, and indulgence versus restraint. When talking about cultural dimensions, there are a few things that you should have to keep in mind. A culture most often does not have all the traits of one cultural dimension. A cultural dimension does not intend to describe individuals, but a culture, a group as a whole. Only one element of a cultural dimension doesn't necessarily indicate a certain type of culture. And now that we clarified this, let's go into a bit more detail about what each cultural dimension means. And first one is power distance, or the orientation towards authority, the extent to which people of certain culture expect and accept the unequal distribution of power. We have cultures in which power distance is higher, and here inequality is expected. The supervisor is responsible if something goes wrong. Respect is thought as a vital value. There is a tendency of centralization. The powerful enjoy privileges. At the other end, in societies or cultures with lower power distance, we have reduced inequality. The supervisor and the subordinate are responsible if something goes wrong. Equality is the most important value, and there is a tendency for decentralization, and everybody has the same rights. What is individual versus collectivism? This refers to orientation towards community, or the extent to which people perceive themselves to be independent or dependent of the others. And in an individualistic culture, there are loose ties between individuals. The focus is on tasks. The people communicate directly. Appraisals are directed to individuals. Failure means guilt. In a collectivistic culture, people are integrated in strong groups. The focus is on relationship. People use an indirect way of communicating. Appraisals are directed to groups. Failure means shame. Masculinity versus femininity. This refers to orientation to goals, or the degree to which the related values are important guidelines in a culture. And in a masculine culture, we have focus on competitiveness, material success, and progress. In a feminine society, we have focus on caring, nurturing, relationships, family life. In a masculine society, people live to work. They have longer working hours and shorter vacation time. The gender roles are clearly defined. Men are expected to be assertive and ambitious. Women are expected to be soft and subservient. Here, people try to argue their idea as the right one. At the other end, in a feminine society, people work to live. Gender roles are flexible. Exceptional achievements are rather played down. Emphasis is on modesty. People try finding a solution that suits everyone. Let's see what's uncertainty avoidance about. This refers to orientation to structure, the extent to which members of a cultural group feel comfortable or uncomfortable with unstructured or unknown situations. And in a society with high uncertainty avoidance, people don't like risk. Uncertainty is regarded as dangerous. There are strict laws, rules, and security. What is different is considered dangerous. People live in an absolute truth. In a society with low uncertainty avoidance, uncertainty is viewed as normal. The society has as few rules as possible. What is different seems strange and not dangerous, and different views are accepted. And now the last two cultural dimensions that were added later, long-term versus short-term. And this refers to the extent to which people foster virtues oriented towards future or towards past and present. In a long-term or pragmatic society, the important values are perseverance and thrift. In a short-term or normative society, the important values are respect for tradition, preservation of faith, fulfilling social obligation. In a long-term society, negotiation procedures are usually longer. Truth depends on situation, context, and time. A good person adapts to the circumstances. The family life is guided by shared tasks. The saving quota is large. Students attribute success to effort. In a normative or short-term culture, people expect quick results. The truth is absolute. There are universal guidelines about what is good and evil. A good person is always the same. Family life is guided by imperatives. The social spending and consumption are high. Students attribute success to luck. And lastly, indulgence versus restraint, which refers to orientations to happiness or the extent to which people try to control their desires and impulses. In an indulgent society, basic needs can be satisfied relatively freely. People feel they are able to control their life. Leisure is important. People involved in sports. Objects are bought for use, and material rewards don't really motivate. In a restrained society, gratification is suppressed and regulated. People tend to feel treated unfair easily. Leisure is not important. People are not involved in sports. Objectives are bought for status. People expect material rewards for a job well done. These characteristics that cultures can have consequences on the way businesses can be run across international markets. For example, in a collectivistic society, we should allow time for relationship building. Trust is critical. The focus is on the context of business relationship. We have to pay attention to protocol, etiquette in order to preserve face. In this type of society, we make decisions consensually. We have to be prepared for repeated presentations and discussions. We communicate indirectly. We use silence to enhance comfort level, and we avoid direct questions. In an individualistic society, the focus is on transaction. We emphasize the contract and give data about short-term gains. We use data and logic. We use, for example, facts, statistics, best practices that appeal to our partners. We communicate directly, we use explicit messages. We value time. We estimate the time required for a decision or task, and we give a precise date for answering. And these are the 6 cultural dimensions. They are the one that influence the patterns of thinking without us being necessarily aware. And in an international setting, they become even more acute. They are reflected in the meaning people attach to various aspects of life, and they become crystallized in the institutions of a society. But as I said before, it's important to remember that these characteristics don't imply that everyone in a given society is programmed in the same way. There are considerable differences between individuals. And now let's move to an exercise.